create a new defense establishment. Just recently, I'll give you an example with the French, and the French and the British are also nuclear powers, and the French have reached out a little bit and are kind of bringing people under their nuclear umbrella, and don't depend on the United States to be your nuclear umbrella. Have a European-based nuclear umbrella. I think it's a positive case. One missile from the French SSBNs out of the four that they have could destroy Russia.
Now we have established that line to Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg, the former U.S. Special Envoy to Ukraine. Hello to you, General.
John, how are you? Thanks for having me.
I'm very well, and it's very good to hear your voice after those previous failed attempts where you have made it. General, let me ask you first of all, in your judgment, is the war in Ukraine a kind of turning point? Do you think we see Ukraine dug in deeply at the front line using their drones and robots with devastating effects? What is the best hope now for the future for Ukraine, do you think?
Yeah, well, it's much more positive than it was during the winter, because they were using winter the Russians, as a weapon. And once they got through winter, I had said repeatedly on the public TV as well, that the spring, the summer, and the fall would turn to Ukraine as an advantage, because they don't have the winter pressures on them. And I think that you're seeing that it's starting to change. For the first time since 2023, the Ukrainians are gaining ground. I think they're able to fight off the Russians. So I think there is a turning point. I do think that most people are starting to realize that. Even the hardcore opponents of Ukraine now realize that they've held their own, and they're starting to turn that, and they're starting to strike deep within Russia, which is important, and attack targets that are important. What the Russians have done is they've done the same thing the Germans did in World War II, is figure we'll take the population out of the war and basically make them quit. That's not going to happen in Ukraine. Putin can say that all he wants or think it all he wants, but he's going to have to win on the battlefield, and I don't think he is.
Okay, that's an interesting judgment. If we are then at some kind of turning point, generally, a turning point from what to what? Because there's no obvious sign that Putin's minded to, reopen his mind and reopen the possibility of useful talks on ending this war.
Well, I think you're right, but I think we need to look at it, collectively speaking, the free world. As you need to look at it, this is important, not just for Ukraine, but Ukraine can be a partner as well. And what you want to do, you keep Ukraine's long-range pressure and Crimea's isolation intact through any negotiation, which is the leverage that brings Moscow to a real deal. And you don't trade it away for a pause. And I think what you want to do is you treat a sovereign, aligned Ukraine as a strategic asset, not a security case. What you end up as having is Europe's largest combat hardened military.
Yes.
Its largest in sense of size, 800,000, and its defense technology base, look at drones and what they've done in the future, should not be anchored to anything but not to drift towards China, but realize they are again a strategic asset in the future. And when you look at as an operating doctrine of peace through strength, you want sequence, maximum pressure, lock-in guarantees to close it out. And you reject any framing that treats support for Ukraine and the pursuit of peace as opposites. They're the same policy. So I think what you have to do is lead the security work, frame it as a unique bilateral alliance between the nations of Europe and the United States that settles eastern flank of Europe, and it frees us, the United States, to pivot to the Indo-Pacific and the China challenge that we see that's out there right now, and also in more and more increasingly the Middle East as well.
Yes.
There's a lot to be said, but bottom line, they're a near-term asset. You don't want them to turn to the Russians or turn to the Chinese. You want to be a Western-based asset, and with combat capability.
And there is, isn't there, a lot to be said for NATO in Europe treating Ukraine as a full-fledged security partner. But there are obstacles to that. In Europe, you have countries like Slovakia, not the biggest power, but they're a NATO partner. They've got the power of veto when it comes to NATO membership, and as does the United States. It's not entirely clear they would go along with such an idea at this point either.
Well, what you do to negate that is you create a new alliance. You do something differently. See, I mean, you could call it NATO 2.0 or whatever you want to call it. and on security guarantees, but you have to kind of work your way around that. Like Hungary's the same condition; they're not going to vote for Ukraine to be part of NATO. So create a new defense establishment. Just recently, I'll give you an example with the French, and the French and the British are also nuclear powers, and the French have reached out a little bit and are kind of bringing people under their nuclear umbrella, and don't depend on the United States to be your nuclear umbrella. Have a European-based nuclear umbrella. I think it's a positive case. One missile from the French SSBNs out of the four that they have could destroy Russia. When you think about it, because it's got MIRV capability, independent reentry vehicles, and so they have a capability to attack them. And instead of depending only on the United States, create a different alliance system. And maybe you need to go there. Instead, we keep kind of going back to the way NATO was, or would work for NATO, and frankly, probably we need a new alliance. And Ukraine can be a key military strength of that. They can become the Sparta of Europe. Let's be very honest about it. We know that the UK is going down in combat capability. Most of the nations are. The Poles are increasing. The Germans are increasing a little bit. And why don't we develop a new strategy, a new NATO, whatever you want to call it?
And we do know that leaders in Europe do talk about this, but there has to be a worry, General, that were there to be a NATO 0.2, 2.0 with the European powers together and maybe bringing in Ukraine, it might be an incitement to the White House to do what, President Trump and people like Pete Hegseth, his defense secretary, have been wanting to do, which is to disengage further from Europe.
Well, I think what you do is not, when you say disengage, I think you have to watch the phraseology that you use. It's not an abandonment or disengagement. It's just it's a prioritization effort. And you prioritize where you want to be. And now we're focusing on Central and Latin America, the old Monroe Doctrine that's out there. We know the Mideast has taken a lead on, economically speaking. If you cut down the Middle East and oil coming out of that, you head for a worldwide recession. Then we've got to worry about the Far East with China as well. Europe should be, when we talk about Europe can handle the Russians. They just don't admit it. I said to Secretary General Ruda, you're better than you think you are. And I think once you get that thinking locked down, you can get there. I think people worry about being without the United States. Well, I think you deal with that. And it's not a deliberate or a pejorative statement. It's the fact it's a prioritization. And I think that's healthy.
Fascinating talking to you, General. Thank you. Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg there, the former U.S. envoy to Ukraine.